The Civil War left the United States in ruins, but its end was not the end of conflict. In many ways, it was the beginning of another chapter, one just as decisive. Reconstruction, stretching from 1863 to 1877, was nothing less than an effort to remake the nation. Cities, towns, and entire economies lay in ashes. The South, once the proud bastion of cotton and slavery, was wrecked. 4 million men, women, and children who had lived their lives in bondage were now free. The Union had been preserved on the battlefield, but could it endure in the hearts of its people? This was the great experiment. Could a nation that had been so deeply divided, that endured such extraordinary violence, be rebuilt not merely as it had been before, but on a new foundation? Could liberty be extended to all Americans, not just in name, but in daily life? The stakes of Reconstruction were immense. In these years, the country tested whether democracy could adapt, whether freedom could expand, or whether old systems of power would reassert themselves. The Reconstruction posed fundamental questions. First, the political question: how should the South be restored to the Union? Should reunion be swift and forgiving or stern and punishing? Lincoln envisioned a lenient process, but others argued only strict conditions could ensure true change. Second, the practical matter of rebuilding a devastated region. Railroads had been torn up, farms laid waste, factories destroyed. The South faced physical ruin as well as moral crisis. Third, the matter of social transformation. How would a society that had been built on slavery adapt to emancipation? Could the institutions of the South, its courts, schools, and governments, be remade to reflect equality? And finally, the most pressing challenge of all: how to protect the rights of the freed men. Freedom was proclaimed in law, but could it be made real in practice? Would freed men be citizens with full rights, or would they be relegated to second class status? Overlaying all of this was a struggle over power between branches of government. Would Reconstruction be directed by the executive branch, as Lincoln and later Johnson attempted, or by Congress, dominated by Republicans determined to enforce a broader vision of change? The contest between president and legislature was not simply procedural, it was a struggle for the very meaning of victory in the Civil War. The Freedmen's Bureau, established in March 1865, was one of the most remarkable initiatives in American history. Its mission was ambitious: to aid former slaves and impoverished Southern whites as they transitioned into a new social order. Its greatest achievements came in the realm of education. Bureau agents and Northern teachers, often young men and women inspired by the ideas of abolition, established schools across the South. For the first time, thousands of freed men learned to read and write. Literacy meant more than letters on a page. It was the key to citizenship, to independence, to being able to read the Bible or understand a labor contract. There were also grander ideas. Some advocated that confiscated southern plantations should be redistributed. Quote, 40 acres and a mule, the promise went. Imagine what a revolution that might have been. Land in the hands of formerly enslaved, a genuine redistribution of southern wealth. But this vision rarely materialized. Political opposition and the deep seated desire of white Southerners to retain control of their land made it almost impossible. For most freedmen, freedom would come without property, leaving them vulnerable to economic exploitation. The Freedmen's Bureau was a lightning rod. To many white Southerners, it was nothing less than federal meddling in local affairs. They saw Bureau agents as interlopers, stirring up discontent, undermining the old order. Southern newspapers railed against what they called Northern interference. Yet to many freedmen, the Bureau represented hope, tangible evidence that the federal government recognized their freedom and sought to defend it. Northern missionaries and reformers traveled south, often at great personal risk, to teach, to minister, and to advocate. Some were met with open hostility, even violence. In this clash of perceptions, we glimpsed the deeper conflict of Reconstruction itself. For some, it was a noble attempt to create a more equal society. For others, it was an imposition, a humiliation, and a threat. Even before the war ended, debate over Reconstruction had begun. In 1863, Lincoln issued his 10% plan, offering leniency once 10% of voters in seceded states swore loyalty to the Union and accepted emancipation. That state could rejoin. It was generous, pragmatic, and aimed at reconciliation. But not everyone agreed. Congressional Republicans, fearing Lincoln's plan was too lenient, crafted the Wade Davis bill. It demanded 50% loyalty oaths and excluded former Confederates from politics. Lincoln pocket vetoed it, choosing not to provoke a direct clash. This struggle over percentages and oaths symbolized a deeper issue. What would reunion mean? Would it be a simple restoration of the old Union or a transformation into something new? And when Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens was elected to Congress in 1866, it revealed how eager many Southerners were to return to power as if nothing had changed. For Northern Republicans, it confirmed their fears. Leniency could mean surrendering the very gains of the war. When Lincoln was assassinated, the presidency fell to Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat from Tennessee who had remained loyal to the Union. At first, his rise inspired hope. Here was a man who might bridge North and South. But Johnson quickly revealed himself to be stubborn, thin skinned, and deeply unsympathetic to the plight of the freed men. He recognized Lincoln's provisional governments, demanded ratification of the 13th Amendment, but pardoned countless former Confederates. Soon, Southern planters and politicians, the very men who had led the rebellion, were returning to positions of authority. Johnson's Reconstruction seemed to restore, rather than remake, Southern society. This leniency infuriated Northern Republicans, who saw the hard won victory of the war slipping away. Johnson believed he was defending states' rights and restraining federal power. But in reality, he was enabling a swift return of Southern elites, leaving freed men vulnerable. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery. On paper, it was the most revolutionary change in the Constitution since the Bill of Rights. It destroyed the legal foundation of slavery, altering forever the relationship between master and slave. But the promise of freedom ran headlong into the reality of economics. Land remained in the hands of white elites, and freed men lacking property or credit were forced into arrangements that bound them to the soil. Thus arose sharecropping, a system in which tenants farmed land that they did not own, giving a portion of their crops to landlords. In practice, it kept both black and poor white farmers in cycles of debt and dependency. Thus, the legacy of slavery endured in another form. Freedom had come, but independence had not. The soil itself seemed to bind men to the old order, and generations would toil under its burdens. The Black Codes, passed in 1865 and 1866, revealed the deaths of Southern resistance. These laws sought to preserve as much of the old racial order as possible. Freedmen could not serve on juries, could not testify against whites, could not vote, and were forced into labor contracts under threat of arrest. The intent was clear: to ensure a, quote, stable labor supply for white landowners and to recreate in all but name the structure of slavery. In many ways, the Black Codes were the South's declaration of defiance, an attempt to say emancipation may be law, but it will not change our way of life. For freedmen, this was a bitter revelation. Freedom was theirs, but without land, without political power, and with a hostile state governments, their liberty was fragile. The Black Codes provoked outrage in the North and convinced many Republicans that harsher measures were necessary. By 1866, tensions between President Johnson and Congress had reached a breaking point. When Southerners sent former Confederate generals and politicians back to Washington, including even the Vice President of the Confederacy, Northern Republicans were stunned. Was this what Union victory meant? That the very men who had led secession were reclaiming power as if nothing had changed? Johnson believed that he was following Lincoln's model of reconciliation, but the difference was stark. Lincoln's plan had been grounded in vision and statesmanship. Johnson's was driven by obstinacy and personal grievance. He seemed determined to thwart Republicans at every turn. Congress responded by demanding a stricter program, what would become known as congressional or radical Reconstruction. For Republicans, the question was clear. If Reconstruction were left in the hands of the president, the victory of the Union Army would be squandered. If left in the hands of Congress, perhaps it could still be redeemed. This confrontation soon became a constitutional crisis. Johnson vetoed an extension of the Freedmen's Bureau in February 1866. Congress overrode him. He vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which granted citizenship to African Americans and sought to strike down the black coats. Congress overrode him again. This was the first time in American history that Congress had overridden a presidential veto of such magnitude. Not once, but twice. It was more than a clash of laws, it was a clash of visions. Johnson envisioned a restored Union under white Southern control. Congress envisioned a Union remade, where black Americans held equal rights under the law. The power dynamic shifted. For the first time since the nation's founding, Congress asserted itself as the dominant branch, shaping national policy against the will of the president. Out of this conflict emerged the 14th Amendment. Ratified in 1868, it was the most profound transformations in the history of the Constitution. It declared that all persons born or naturalized in the United States were citizens. This included African Americans, reversing the infamous Dred Scott decision, which had declared that no black man could ever be a citizen. The amendment also required states to provide equal protection of the laws and due process to all citizens. These phrases would echo down the corridors of American history, forming the backbone of later decisions on civil rights, voting, marriage, and more. The 14th Amendment also barred Confederate leaders from office and punished states that denied suffrage to black men by reducing their representation in Congress. It was both a shield and a shield for the rights of citizens and a sword against those who sought to undo the Union's victory. By 1867, Congress had taken control entirely. The Reconstruction Acts divided the South into 5 military districts, each overseen by Union generals. These generals had authority to protect freedmen and enforce federal law. To be readmitted, states had to write new constitutions recognizing black suffrage and ratify the 13th and 14th Amendments. This was an extraordinary use of federal power. The South placed under direct military rule until it complied. It was also a moment of radical possibility. For the first time, freedmen could vote, hold office, and shape the governments of their states. The old planter class was temporarily dislodged, and new coalitions of freedmen, northern, quote, carpetbaggers, and southern, quote, scallywags, took their place. Reconstruction became not just about rebuilding, but about reimagining democracy itself. President Johnson, furious at congressional dominance, tested the limits of power. In 1867, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, requiring Senate approval before the president could remove a cabinet official. Johnson defied it, dismissing Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. The House of Representatives responded with impeachment. For the first time in U.S. history, a president was brought to trial before the Senate. The charge, abuse of power and defiance of law. The nation watched as Johnson's fate hung in the balance. In the end, he survived, but barely. The Senate fell just one vote short of the two-thirds majority needed for removal. Johnson remained in office, but politically he was finished. His presidency ended in disgrace, his vision of Reconstruction discredited. The era produced three monumental amendments: the 13th, abolishing slavery; the 14th, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection; and the 15th, ratified in 1870, securing the right to vote for black men. Together, they transformed the Constitution from a framework tolerating slavery into a charter of freedom and equality. They redefined American citizenship itself. And yet, these amendments would be tested and often betrayed in the years to come. Laws are words on paper. It takes will, institutions, and vigilance to bring them to life. Reconstruction planted the seeds, but they would take a century to bear fruit. For a brief moment, the nation seemed to live out the words of its founding documents. In cartoons and speeches and in public celebrations, the image of diverse citizenry gathered at one table took shape. Freedmen voted, served on juries, and even took seats in Congress. It was, to be sure, imperfect and fragile, but it was unprecedented. The promise of democracy, a government truly of, by, and for the people, had never seemed so close to realization. Reconstruction brought real change, however temporary. Black men voted in large numbers, held office in state legislatures, and even the U.S. Congress. Hiram Revels, elected to the Senate in 1870, occupied the very seat once held by Jefferson Davis. It was an extraordinary reversal of history. Across the South, African Americans served on juries, in city councils, and constitutional conventions. For the first time, democracy in the United States expanded to include those who had been excluded for centuries. Though white Southerners derided these governments as corrupt or illegitimate, they represented a genuine revolution in American politics. But this revolution was fragile. By the mid 1870s, white Democrats, calling themselves Redeemers, launched a determined effort to reclaim power. Using intimidation, violence, and fraud, they suppressed black voting and dismantled Reconstruction governments. Republican coalitions in the South had been diverse. Freedmen, Northern newcomers called carpetbaggers, and Southern whites who had cooperated, known as scallywags. Some came to the profit, others to help, but together they formed a political base for change. Once Redeemers gained momentum, however, the coalition crumbled. By 1880, most Southern Democrats were firmly back in Democratic hands. By the early 1870s, the bright promise of Reconstruction was dimming. Opposition in the South, always fierce, now took organized and violent form. Out of the ashes of the Confederacy arose the Ku Klux Klan, a secretive brotherhood dedicated to securing white supremacy and resisting the new order imposed by federal authority. Hooded and armed, they terrorized freedmen and white allies alike. To vote, to hold office, even to learn to read became in many places acts of extraordinary courage. President Ulysses S. Grant, determined to defend the work of the Reconstruction, pressed Congress for action. The result was the Force Acts of 1870 and 1871, measures designed to curb the Klan and protect black suffrage. Federal troops were dispatched. Prosecutions followed. For a brief moment, the violence was checked, and Grant's administrations could claim success. Quote, "Hurrah for Grant," the newspapers declared, but the victory was temporary. Meanwhile, Congress attempted another bold step, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, which guaranteed equal access to public accommodations and the right to serve on juries. It was a sweeping declaration of racial equality. Yet, it was rarely enforced, left to languish in the very states where hostility ran deepest. And in 1883, the Supreme Court struck it down, ruling that the federal government could not prevent discrimination by individuals, only by states. It was as if the great principles of Reconstruction had been carved in marble, but left to weather unprotected in the storm. By the mid 1870s, the North itself was wary. The pressing urgency of war and emancipation gave way to economic recession, political scandals, and the everyday concerns of people eager to look forward rather than back. In Washington, as in countless northern towns, the plight of the freedmen was no longer the first priority. Reconstruction, once the central project of the nation, was slipping from the forefront of public will. And so, step by step, Reconstruction unraveled. Federal intervention had produced some undeniable gains. The Union was reunited. For the first time in American history, African Americans entered politics in significant numbers. Voting, holding office and shaping local governments. The very relationships between black and white citizens had been rearranged, if only temporarily. The Civil War had ended slavery. It also ended the notion of secession, affirming the supremacy of the federal government over the states. But it had not remade the South's economic foundation. Plantation lands remained largely in white hands, and sharecropping bound both freedmen and poor whites to a system of dependency and debt. In countless ways, the old order endured beneath a new veneer. The Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, the 14th, and 15th, stood as monumental achievements, granting freedom, citizenship, and the vote. Yet in practice, these rights were progressively stripped away. Violence, intimidation, discriminatory laws, and hostile court rulings hollowed out their promise. Segregation hardened into law. Jim Crow became the order of the day. Still, the story of Reconstruction is not only one of failure. The judicial principles enshrined in these amendments remained. They were dormant for decades but not lost. Nearly a century later, in the mid 20th century, they would become the very foundation for the civil rights movement. When the Supreme Court struck down segregation in Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, it was the 14th Amendment that gave the decision its power. Thus, Reconstruction leaves us with a legacy at once tragic and enduring. It was a moment of bold vision, cut short by opposition and fatigue. Yet its principles remained, waiting for another generation to claim them. In this, Reconstruction reminds us that progress in American history is rarely a straight line, but rather a long, uneven struggle, full of victories and setbacks, yet always pressing towards the ideal of liberty fulfilled. The election of 1876 brought Reconstruction to its final chapter. Republican Rutherford B. Hayes faced Democrat Samuel Tilden. Tilden won the popular vote and appeared to set to triumph, but contested returns in three southern states threw the outcome into doubt. After weeks of wrangling, a compromise was reached. Hayes would become president, but federal troops would be withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction would end. This, quote, compromise of 1877 was celebrated as a peaceful resolution, but it marked a profound retreat. For Southern blacks, it meant abandonment. The federal shield that had guarded their rights was gone. The Supreme Court also dealt fatal blows to Reconstruction. In 1883, it struck down the Civil Rights Act of 1875, declaring that the 14th Amendment applied only to state actions, not to individuals. Private citizens could discriminate as they pleased. In 1896, Plessy v. Ferguson enshrined segregation under the doctrine of separate but equal. It was a bitter irony. The amendments intended to guarantee equality were now interpreted to permit racial separation. In this way, the highest court in the land sanctioned the very racial order Reconstruction had tried to dismantle. White leaders spoke of a, quote, new South, rebuilt through industry, railroads, and commerce. And indeed, there was some modernization. Textile mills rose, ironworks expanded, and rail lines lengthened. But beneath this surface of progress, the old agricultural system endured. Sharecropping and tenant farming kept millions, black and white, in poverty. For freedmen, the New South brought new forms of hardship. Violence, segregation, and economic exploitation were constant companions. Freedom had been won, but equality remained elusive. The dream of Reconstruction had faded into a harsher reality. By the end of the 19th century, white Southerners erected a system of laws designed to strip black citizens of political power. Literacy tests, poll taxes, property requirements, and grandfather clauses effectively excluded most African Americans from voting. This system became known as Jim Crow, named after a demeaning minstrel caricature. It was not just legal, but cultural. a regime of segregation that permeated every aspect of Southern life. The rights promised in the 14th and 15th Amendments were hollowed out, replaced by nearly a century of enforced inequality. Reconstruction had promised a new birth of freedom. Instead, its failure left a legacy of broken promises, one that would not be redeemed until the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Here ends the video.